The embalming room was quiet, the way it always is at 6 in the morning. Just the hum of the refrigeration units and the particular stillness that settles over a place built for grief. My assistant knocked twice, softly, and told me quietly that the Selwyn family had arrived early for their scheduled 9 o'clock arrangement meeting. I checked the file, the way I check every single file, and my whole chest went completely still when I read the name of the deceased. My name is Vivian Marchetti. I am 41 years old, and I own a small, well-regarded funeral home in Charleston, South Carolina. 6 years ago, at my own partner's memorial, my Aunt Diane stood in a hallway and told a cousin, in a voice she thought I could not hear. Some relationships, she said, simply were not real family, no matter how long they lasted. This morning, Diane was sitting quietly in my own lobby, waiting to plan her husband's funeral, with absolutely no idea whose firm she had just walked into. Let me take you back to where this actually started. Before I do, if stories like this one matter to you, hit that like button and subscribe. It genuinely helps a small channel like mine reach the people who need to hear it. And tell me in the comments, honestly, whether someone in your family ever tried to quietly erase a person you loved. I read every single one, usually the same evening I post a story. All right, let's go back to the beginning. I met Noel when I was 26, at a mutual friend's wedding, standing near the dessert table because neither of us knew many people there, and it seemed like the safest corner of the room to hide in. She made a joke about the terrible band, low and dry, and I laughed harder than the joke actually deserved, and that was more or less the entire beginning of the next 11 years of my life. We were together for 11 years, the last 4 of them married, quietly, in a small ceremony neither of our extended families fully understood how to celebrate. Noel worked as a public school music teacher, patient in a way I never quite managed to be with children myself. She used to say our two professions were secretly the same job, showing up for people, during the exact seasons of life nobody else particularly wants to sit through. She meant that as a joke, mostly, but I have thought about it often since her death, because I think she was more right than either of us realized at the time. We built a small, ordinary life together, dinners most nights at our own kitchen table, a garden of our own that never grew half as well as Harold's did. We had a habit of reading the Sunday paper out loud to each other over coffee, badly, in exaggerated voices, until we were both laughing too hard to finish a single article properly. I proposed on a Tuesday, of all days, in our own kitchen, with no ring yet purchased and no real plan. There was only the sudden certainty that waiting 11 years and both of us having jobs the next morning was somehow more romantic than waiting for a weekend. Noel laughed at me, genuinely, for picking the least dramatic possible moment, and then she said yes before I had even fully finished the sentence. We bought rings together, the following weekend, from a small jeweler 2 blocks from my apprenticeship firm. They were plain gold bands. Neither of us wanted to fuss over, because the fuss, we agreed, was never really the point of any of it. My parents came around, slowly, over time, the way some parents do, learning the small daily language of a marriage they had not expected but eventually chose to love anyway. My Aunt Diane, my father's older sister, never came around at all. She was polite to Noel at gatherings, the careful, brittle kind of polite that costs a person something to maintain, And for years, she referred to Noel, in front of relatives who did not know better, as my roommate. I remember one Thanksgiving, 6 years into the relationship, when Noel brought a pecan pie she had spent all morning making, a recipe from her own grandmother, and set it proudly on Diane's dessert table beside the other pies. Diane thanked her, warmly enough, and then spent the rest of the afternoon introducing every other dish by the name of the person who made it. Except that one, which she simply called the pecan pie, as though it had arrived on its own, unattached to anyone in the room. Noel noticed. She always noticed, quietly, and she never once made a scene about it. But I would catch her, sometimes, on the drive home, staring out the window with a particular stillness I learned to recognize as her own private version of hurt. I want to be fair to Diane, the way I try to be fair to everyone I write about. She grew up in a different decade, with a different vocabulary for the world, and I do not think she woke up any single morning deciding to be cruel. My grandmother, Diane's own mother, raised her children in a household where certain subjects simply were not discussed at the dinner table. Diane, from what my father has told me, absorbed that particular silence early and thoroughly. She was taught, the way an entire generation was taught, that difficult topics belong to a category called private matters. The kindest thing you could do for someone living a private matter was to simply never mention it directly. I understand now that Diane genuinely believed, for years, that calling Noel my roommate was a form of discretion, rather than a form of erasure. She was wrong about that, completely, but I no longer think she arrived at that wrongness through malice. I think she simply never did the work of updating her own understanding. She let that failure to update sit quietly in the room every time Noel and I visited, the way a stain sits on a carpet nobody quite gets around to cleaning. Diane raised 3 children of her own, mostly alone for long stretches while her first husband traveled for work. I think that particular kind of exhausting, solitary competence left her with very little patience, left over for updating her worldview once her children were grown. She was, by every account, a genuinely devoted mother, the kind who never missed a recital or a parent conference. I think she assumed that devotion to her own children settled the entire question of what family required of a person. She never seemed to consider that the definition itself might need to widen, rather than simply be applied harder to the people already inside it. Noel died 6 years ago of an aggressive cancer that gave us 11 brutal months of knowing and then took her anyway. I want to tell you about her memorial because it is the exact hinge this whole story turns on. I held the service myself, professionally, the way I hold every service, because I could not imagine trusting anyone else with the details that mattered. My staff ran the actual logistics that day, out of respect for me, and I sat in the front row instead of standing at the back, the only time in my career I have ever done that. 11 months of illness had given us time to plan the service together, in careful, sometimes darkly funny conversations at her hospital bedside. Noel had been specific about almost everything: the music, the flowers, a particular blue dress she wanted to be remembered in. She had been less specific, deliberately, about the guest list, telling me once, near the end, that she did not want her funeral to become a referendum, on which relatives had finally learned to say her name correctly. I honored that. I did not turn anyone away, including Diane. But some part of me, standing at the door that morning, wondered whether Noel had been more generous in that instruction than I would have been in her position. Diane attended. I want to give her credit for that much. But partway through the reception, in a hallway just off the main room, I overheard her tell my cousin Paloma, in a low voice she assumed was private, that she felt bad for me, genuinely. She said that some relationships simply were not real family, no matter how long they lasted, and that she hoped I would eventually find my way to something more conventional. I stood frozen in that hallway for a long moment, holding a cup of coffee I no longer wanted, and I did not confront her. I did not have it in me that day, grieving the way I was grieving, to spend a single ounce of energy on Diane's opinion of my marriage. I had a service to run, and I ran it. I let the rest of that particular sentence wait. For a day I was better equipped to actually carry it. I want you to hold onto that sentence. Some relationships simply were not real family, because it comes back later in this story, in a room Diane never expected to find it waiting for her. I have wondered since, what would have happened if I had confronted her that same evening, in that same hallway, rather than carrying the sentence quietly for 6 years instead. I think, honestly, that confronting her then would have accomplished very little. Grief has a way of hardening a person's defenses, rather than softening them, and Diane, freshly uncomfortable at her own niece's memorial, was in no state to actually hear anything I might have said to her. Some conversations need the right room to land in, and that hallway, on that particular night, was never going to be the right room for this one. I did not go no contact with Diane after that, not fully, not in any dramatic way. I simply stopped extending myself toward her, the way you stop reaching for a hand that has never once reached back. I attended the mandatory holidays, briefly, politely, and I stopped sharing anything real with her about my life. My father noticed the distance and asked me about it once, gently. I told him the truth, that I had run out of energy for relationships that required me to pretend Noel had mattered less than she did. He did not defend Diane. He simply nodded, the way people nod when they already know something is true and have decided not to make you say it twice. I asked him once, years later, why he never confronted his own sister about the roommate comment. He told me, honestly, that he had tried early on, and that Diane had simply grown quiet and defensive in a way that made the conversation feel more like an attack on her than an actual invitation to change. He said he had decided, at some point, that his energy was better spent, making sure I always knew where he actually stood. That mattered more to him than spending it trying to drag Diane somewhere she was not ready to go on her own. I understood that choice, even when it left me wishing, privately, that someone in the family had fought harder on my behalf while Noel was still alive to feel the difference. I built my career in the years after Noel's death, quietly, the way you build anything that actually matters. I had worked in the funeral industry since my 20s, first as an apprentice at a large firm downtown, learning embalming and restorative care and the specific, exhausting choreography of grief management under people who taught me well. I opened my own small firm 4 years ago, using the last of the money Noel and I had saved together, in a converted Victorian house 2 blocks from the water. I built it, deliberately, around a particular kind of care. I had considered, briefly, staying at the larger firm downtown, since it was stable, established, and paid me reliably well. But I remember sitting with a family there, my last full year on staff, a young man burying his longtime partner. The firm's intake forms still only offered a single blank line, labeled relationship to deceased, no distinction between spouse, partner, or roommate. I filled that line in myself, by hand, writing husband in careful letters. The young man could not quite make his own hand stop shaking, long enough to write it. I decided, driving home that night, that I had a choice to make. I could either keep quietly patching over a system, one built for a narrower kind of family than the one actually walking through the door. Or I could build a different system myself, from the ground up, with better forms and a better memory, for what people actually needed to hear. I still remember the first day the firm was actually open, standing alone in the empty front parlor before my first appointment, the paint barely dry. A single sympathy plant, someone from my old firm had sent as a gift, sat on the reception desk. I called Noel from that empty room, crying a little, telling her I was terrified I had made a foolish, expensive mistake with money we could not easily replace. She told me, calmly, the way she told me most things, that she had never once seen me build something halfway, and that she did not expect this to be the first time. My first client walked in 40 minutes later, and I have not had an empty week since. My apprenticeship years taught me most of the technical skill, embalming, restorative art, the careful chemistry of preservation. But they also taught me something I did not expect to learn, watching my mentor at that larger firm handle a family whose son had died by suicide. It was a family nobody quite knew how to speak to, in a building that had clearly never developed the language for that particular grief either. My mentor sat with that family for 2 full hours before discussing a single logistical detail, just listening, just letting them talk in circles until the circles finally found a center. I decided, watching that the actual service I wanted to offer had very little to do with caskets or flowers. It had everything to do with that specific, unhurried willingness to sit inside someone else's worst day without flinching or rushing them out of it. I had spent 11 years watching how families like mine got treated by funeral homes that did not know what to do with us. There were the careful mispronouns, the awkward pauses, the forms with no language for the relationship actually in the room. I decided, opening my own doors, that no family would ever leave my firm feeling smaller than they walked in. I built a reputation, slowly, one respectful service at a time, for handling exactly the situations other firms fumbled: blended families, estranged relatives, complicated wills, relationships nobody in the room had the right words for yet. Within 3 years, funeral directors across the county were referring families to me specifically for that reason, quietly. It was the way professionals refer difficult cases, to the person they trust most to handle them with dignity. One case, in my second year, has stayed with me more than any other. A man had died leaving behind a wife of 40 years, and, separately, a partner of 6 years nobody in the extended family had known existed. Both women arrived at my office within a day of each other, each certain the other had no legitimate claim to grieve him at all. I sat with each of them separately first, then, carefully, with both of them together, and I did not decide on their behalf whose grief counted more. I simply built a service with room for both of them to be exactly as sad as they actually were, in the same room, without either woman having to shrink to make space for the other. They did not become friends, but they both thanked me, separately, for the same reason that I had refused to make either of them invisible. None of that ever reached Diane. I did not seek her out to tell her. My father, in the careful way families sometimes protect each other from information that might cause friction, never mentioned my business by name in front of her, as far as I know. I do not think Diane had any idea, in 6 full years, that the roommate's business had become one of the most respected discreet firms in the entire Low Country. I had, in fact, been hired twice before by people in Diane's own social circle. Once by a woman from her book club whose husband died unexpectedly, and once by a longtime neighbor handling her own mother's estate. Both times I wondered, briefly, whether either client would mention my name back to Diane afterward. Neither of them ever did, as far as I know. Perhaps grief tends to narrow a person's conversational range for a while, or perhaps my last name, Marchetti, is common enough in Charleston. Nobody, it seems, made the connection to the niece nobody in that family discussed by profession. Either way, I had quietly served people 2 and 3 degrees removed from Diane for years. I was invisible to her, in the exact way she had made me feel invisible at her own table, though I promise you I never once engineered that irony on purpose. The trouble that actually matters in this story started 4 days ago, when my Uncle Harold, Diane's husband, died suddenly of a heart attack in his own garden, tending the roses he had tended every summer of his adult life. I found out from my father over the phone, and I felt the loss genuinely, because whatever complicated feelings I carry about Diane, I always loved Harold uncomplicated and completely. He was warm in a way Diane was not, quick with a joke, quicker with a hand on your shoulder when something was actually wrong. My father cried on the phone that morning, the first time I had heard him cry since I was a child myself. That detail alone told me exactly how much Harold meant to everyone in that family, not only to me. Harold worked 32 years as a civil engineer, mostly on municipal water projects around the Low Country. He used to joke that he had spent his entire career making sure people's taps worked, without ever once getting a single word of thanks for it. He retired at 62, 3 years before his death, and threw himself into that garden with the same quiet, methodical thoroughness he had brought to every water main he ever inspected. Diane told me, at the arrangement meeting, that she had never fully understood why the garden mattered so much to him. That changed the morning after he died, when she stood in it, surrounded by roses he had clearly tended with a level of patient attention. She recognized it, uncomfortably, as the same attention he had spent years quietly extending toward people the rest of the family found easier to overlook. My father told me the details slowly, over that phone call, the way you deliver news you are still absorbing yourself. A neighbor had noticed Harold had not collected his morning paper, 2 days running, and had walked over to check, finding him among the roses where he had apparently been kneeling for some time. The coroner's report, my father said, put the time of death somewhere in the previous evening. That meant Harold had spent his last conscious moments exactly where he most wanted to be, in his own garden, tending the one part of his life that had always belonged entirely to him. I found a strange, small comfort in that detail, even through the shock, because a man who loved his garden that completely deserved, if nothing else, to die inside it rather than somewhere that would have felt like an interruption. I remember one particular Sunday, maybe 8 years ago, when Harold showed up alone at Noel's and my apartment, unannounced, carrying a bag of tomatoes from his garden, no real reason given beyond wanting to see how we were doing. He stayed 2 hours, ate dinner with us, and left, without ever once making the visit about anything, except the actual pleasure of our company. Noel used to say that Harold was the only member of my family who treated visiting us like a reward rather than an obligation. I never once heard her say it with anything but genuine warmth, because it was simply, plainly true. Here is a detail I need to give you now, because it becomes the center of everything that happens later. Harold never once treated Noel like anything other than family. He called her by name, always, never roommate, never the careful non-word Diane preferred. He sent us a card every anniversary, quietly, addressed to both of us. After Noel died, he called me every few months, just to check in, just to ask how I was actually doing. His voice made clear he expected an honest answer, rather than a polite one. I did not know, until 4 days ago, how far that quiet loyalty had actually gone. Harold's family needed a funeral home on short notice, the way families always do after a sudden death. Diane, according to my father, asked several people in her social circle for a recommendation, wanting somewhere discreet and well-regarded. Harold's extended family includes some complicated relationships of its own, a first marriage, an estranged son from that marriage, details Diane wanted handled with real tact, rather than paraded in front of 100 distant relatives. 3 separate people, independently, recommended the same small firm on the water, the one everyone in Charleston seemed to agree, handled exactly this kind of situation better than anyone else in the region. One of those 3 recommendations came from Diane's own hairdresser, who mentioned, in passing, that her own sister's blended family had used the same firm the previous spring. They had been treated, in her exact words, like every single person at that funeral mattered equally, regardless of which marriage or which decade they belonged to. Another recommendation came from a coworker of Harold's, who had heard the same praise secondhand from a neighbor. Diane wrote the firm's name down on a sticky note, without asking a single follow-up question about who actually ran it. By that point, 3 independent endorsements felt like more than enough certainty for a decision she needed to make quickly, in the middle of the worst week of her life. Diane called my firm's front desk 2 days ago and scheduled an arrangement meeting, entirely unaware, apparently, of whose name was actually on the deed. I want to ask you something before I tell you what happened when she walked through my door. Have you ever had someone who dismissed you for years end up, by pure chance, standing directly in front of the thing they never believed you could build? Tell me about it in the comments, honestly, because I think a surprising number of people carry some version of that exact moment, and I read every single one, usually the same night I post a story. All right, let me tell you what happened in my lobby. I do not normally handle first arrangement meetings myself anymore, My staff is excellent, and I have trained them precisely for this kind of conversation. But I recognized the family name on the schedule the moment it came across my desk, and some part of me, some part I am still examining honestly, wanted to see her face when she realized. My office manager, a steady, perceptive woman named Odessa, has worked beside me for 3 of my 4 years in business. She noticed my face change when I read the file and asked, quietly, whether I wanted her to take the meeting instead. Odessa knows the whole story, the roommate years, the hallway comment at Noel's memorial. She was the one who helped me build this firm from an empty Victorian house into something real. She has never once needed me to explain twice why a particular family name might land differently than another. I told her I wanted to take this one myself, and she studied my face for a moment longer, the way she does when she is deciding whether to push back on a decision. Then she simply nodded and told me she would be nearby if I needed her, the same steady presence she has been for me on every difficult morning since we first opened these doors together. I walked out to the lobby myself that morning, in the same navy suit I wear to every difficult meeting. Diane looked up from the intake paperwork she was filling out, and for one full second she looked directly at me and registered nothing at all. I understand why now. 6 years is a long time, and she had spent most of those years actively not looking at me. It was the particular way people avoid looking directly at something they have decided not to think about. She had never once pictured what my actual work looked like, only the vague, dismissive shape of it, my niece who does something with funerals now. None of that vague shape came with an actual face attached to it. Mine, standing in a navy suit, holding a leather folder with her husband's name already printed on the intake form. I said, gently, the way I greet every grieving family, Diane, and I watched her face do something I will remember for the rest of my life. Recognition arrived first, sharp and sudden. Then something that looked almost like fear, though I did not fully understand yet what she was afraid of. Then, last, a kind of dawning horror, the particular horror of a person realizing the discreet, highly recommended firm she had chosen, out of everyone in the city, belonged entirely to the niece. That niece was the one she had spent years quietly writing out of her own definition of family. Odessa told me, afterward, that she had been watching the whole exchange from the reception desk, pretending to sort intake folders. She was ready to step in, the moment I gave any small signal that I wanted rescuing. She said she had never seen anyone's face do quite what Diane's did, 3 distinct emotions in under 5 seconds. It was the way a person's expression moves, when a lifetime of small assumptions gets rearranged all at once, in front of witnesses, with no time to prepare a more composed version of themselves first. I told Odessa I had felt, in that exact moment, an odd mixture of vindication and something closer to sorrow. I was watching a woman I had spent years quietly protecting myself from finally understand exactly how much she had missed by keeping her distance. She said, "Vivian, I didn't know. I had no idea this was your place." I told her, calmly, the way I speak to every family in that lobby regardless of history, that I understood, and that we could absolutely find her a different firm if she preferred, no offense taken, no questions asked. I meant that offer completely. I want you to understand that I meant it. This is not a story about forcing someone to sit in a room with me against her will. Diane was quiet for a long moment, standing there with Harold's obituary draft still in her hand. And then she said something that surprised me more than anything else in this entire story. She said that Harold had told her, more than once over the years, that if anything ever happened to him, he wanted me to be the one who handled it, whatever that meant. She had never fully understood why he cared so specifically about a request like that, until she was standing in my lobby, realizing exactly why. She told me Harold had made that particular request 3 separate times over the years, always in the same offhand tone he used for small household matters, the way you might mention where the spare key was hidden. The first time, she said, she had simply assumed he meant it as a professional preference, since he had always respected my work ethic, even when he stayed quiet about the rest of the family's opinion of it. It was only the third time, delivered with unusual seriousness during a hospital waiting room, after his own minor cardiac scare 2 years earlier, that she began to suspect. The request, she realized, carried more weight than a simple professional preference. She had never asked him directly what he meant. She told me, sitting in my consultation room, that she deeply regretted that particular silence now, more than almost any other silence in their 31 years of marriage. I did not say anything for a moment. I simply asked if she would like to sit down, and I walked her back to my private consultation room myself. I want to describe honestly what that meeting was like, because it is not the confrontation people might expect from a story like this one. Diane and I sat across a small table, and we spoke almost entirely about Harold. We talked about the service he would have wanted, about the specific hymn he used to hum badly in the garden, about his rose bushes, and whether the family wanted a small arrangement of them at the service. We did not discuss the hallway comment from Noel's memorial. We did not discuss the roommate years. We simply did the work in front of us, the way I do the work in front of me with every family, because grief does not wait politely for old arguments to resolve themselves first. Diane cried twice during that first hour, quietly, apologizing both times for the tears, and I told her, the way I tell every family, that this room exists specifically so she never has to apologize for that in it. She asked, at one point, whether I thought Harold had suffered. I told her the honest truth, that his own doctor had described the heart attack as almost certainly instant, and that his gardening gloves were still on his hands when the paramedics arrived. As far as anyone could tell, he had simply been kneeling among his roses one moment and gone the next. She held onto that detail visibly, the way people hold onto the smallest available mercy in the worst week of their life. I watched her write it down, on the same legal pad where she was tracking hymn choices, as though she needed it recorded somewhere permanent. It was near the end of that meeting, while reviewing Harold's own prearranged file, that I found the sealed envelope. It was paperwork he had quietly filled out with my firm 18 months earlier, without ever telling either of us. I want to sit with this detail for a moment, because it took me the rest of that day to fully understand its weight. Harold had visited my firm 18 months ago, alone, without Diane, and prearranged his own funeral in careful detail, the way some people do when they want to spare their families difficult decisions later. Buried in that file, in his own handwriting, was a sealed envelope addressed simply to Vivian. His instructions said it should only be opened by me, personally, after his death, and only in the presence of whoever needed to hear it read aloud. Diane, sitting across from me, saw the envelope and asked, quietly, what it was. I told her the truth, that I did not know. Harold's instructions were for me to open it in front of whoever needed to hear it. She asked if that meant her. I told her I honestly did not know, but that we could find out together if she wanted to. She said yes, quietly, without a single moment of visible hesitation at all. Inside that envelope was a letter and a small enamel pin, the kind sold at community fundraisers. It had a simple rainbow design, worn soft at the edges from years in someone's coat pocket. The letter, in Harold's familiar looping handwriting, explained that he had carried that pin quietly in his coat pocket for 9 years, since the year Vivian and Noel got married. It was his own small private way of standing with us, even when the rest of the family could not quite manage it out loud. He wrote that he loved Diane completely, and that he understood the world she came from. He had decided, privately, years ago, that loving his wife did not require him to agree with everything she believed. He had chosen, quietly, to be the uncle who showed up differently than she did. He asked, in that letter, that whoever heard it read aloud understand something simple. A family can hold 2 people who disagree completely and still both belong inside it, as long as at least one of them keeps choosing, actively, to make room for the other. I read that letter aloud, in a shaking voice I did not entirely recognize as my own, and Diane sat across from me and cried, fully, for the first time since Harold's death, according to what she told me later. I do not think she was crying only for Harold in that moment. I think she was crying for the version of herself Harold had quietly, patiently, been trying to reach for years, the version who could have made room the way he made room, if she had only let herself. Diane took the pin home with her that first night, asking if she could hold on to it until the funeral. She told me, weeks later, that she had sat at her own kitchen table until nearly 2 in the morning, turning it over in her hands. She was trying to remember whether she had ever once noticed Harold reach into that particular coat pocket over the years. She said she began to recall small moments differently once she knew what he had been carrying. There was a habit he had of patting his own chest absent-mindedly during certain conversations, a specific stillness that would come over him whenever someone at a gathering made a comment about Vivian's roommate. She had read all of that, for years, as simply Harold being Harold, quiet and even-tempered. She told me she now understood it as something closer to restraint, a man holding his tongue around a pin he never once took out to defend, because he had decided defending it loudly was never actually the point. Here is a question I want to ask you before I finish telling you what happened after that letter. Have you ever discovered, after it was almost too late to say so, that someone you loved had been quietly on your side the entire time, in ways you never got to properly thank them for? Tell me about it in the comments, because I think grief carries that particular ache more often than any of us admit, and I read every single one. All right, let me tell you how this actually ended. I should mention, before I continue, that Odessa read a portion of that letter over my shoulder, later that same evening. The office had emptied out by then, and I finally allowed myself to sit with it properly, away from Diane, away from the careful professional composure I had held all afternoon. She did not say much. She simply put a hand on my shoulder, the way she does when words feel insufficient. She told me that Harold sounded like exactly the kind of man this profession exists to honor, quietly, and without ever needing the credit for it. Harold's funeral, 6 days later, was held at my firm, planned in careful detail by Diane and me together. We worked side by side, in a way neither of us could have predicted a week earlier. I placed a small arrangement of his own rose bushes near the casket, exactly as the letter had described wanting. And I wore the small enamel pin he had carried for 9 years, pinned quietly to the inside of my jacket lapel, where only I would know it was there. Diane asked me, the morning of the service, whether I would say a few words, and I told her I was not certain that was appropriate, given our history. She told me quietly that Harold would have wanted exactly that. She was asking me herself, not out of obligation, but because she had spent the last week finally understanding what her husband had understood about me for years. I said yes. I spoke for 3 minutes about Harold's garden, about his laugh, about the specific loyalty of a man who chose, quietly, to be different from the family he came from, one small private gesture at a time. I did not mention the pin directly. I did not need to. Diane knew, and I knew, and that was enough. Harold's estranged son, from his first marriage, came to the service, a fact that surprised nearly everyone in the room except me, since I had spoken with him myself during the arrangements. He and Harold had reconciled quietly, over the last 3 years, in a series of fishing trips. Neither of them had ever mentioned to the rest of the family. He stood at the back of the chapel the whole service, near enough to hear everything, far enough to avoid any questions about who exactly he was. Diane recognized him from an old photograph, and to her credit, walked over herself during the reception. She introduced herself plainly, and told him she was glad Harold had found his way back to him before it was too late. It was a small moment, easy to miss in a room full of grief, but I noticed it because I recognized, in it, the same quiet effort she was only just beginning to make with me. I thought, watching that exchange, about how much of this story is really about who gets to define the boundaries of a family. It is also about who simply decides, quietly, to widen them anyway. Harold widened his, one relationship at a time, without ever announcing the decision out loud. His son had widened his own circle enough to forgive a father who had been absent for most of his childhood. Diane, I think, was only just beginning to understand that widening a family does not shrink the space inside it. It simply asks the people already there to hold a little more than they were originally prepared to hold. Diane and I have genuinely spoken more in the 6 weeks since Harold's funeral than we spoke in the 6 full years before it. She has not fully apologized, not the entire word, though she came genuinely close once over coffee. She told me quietly that she genuinely wished she had found the version of herself Harold saw in her, while he was still alive to actually watch her find it. I told her, honestly, that it was not too late to keep finding it now, and I meant every single word of that completely. That coffee took place at a small shop 2 blocks from my firm, a place Noel and I used to visit most Sundays. I remember watching Diane look around the room, taking in the mismatched chairs and the chalkboard menu, the way you take in a place someone you love clearly loved first. She asked, carefully, whether this had been our regular spot. When I told her yes, she went quiet for a moment. Then she said she wished. Now, she had asked a question like that years earlier, while there was still a version of the answer that included both of us sitting there together. I told her that most of the important questions in a family arrive late, not because nobody could have asked them sooner, but because asking requires admitting you should have asked already, and that admission is often the hardest part. She asked me, that same afternoon, about the pecan pie, the one Noel had made for that long-ago Thanksgiving, the recipe from her grandmother. I told her the truth, that I still had the recipe card, in Noel's own handwriting, tucked inside a cookbook I rarely open anymore. Diane asked if she could see it sometime, and I told her yes, she could see it whenever she liked. I meant that the way I mean most things I say to her now, carefully, honestly, without any interest in making the offer feel like more forgiveness than I have actually finished extending. She asked me recently if she could see a photograph of Noel, one I actually chose myself, rather than the vague absence she had allowed herself for years. I showed her 3. She looked at each one for a long time, and she asked Noel's middle name, something she had genuinely never known in 11 years of our relationship. I told her, and she wrote it down, carefully, in a small notebook she now keeps for exactly this purpose. She is learning, slowly, the family she had spent years refusing to fully see. She asked, that same afternoon, whether I would consider bringing her to visit Noel's grave sometime, an offer she made carefully, watching my face the entire time for any sign I wanted to say no. I said yes almost immediately, before I had even fully considered it. Some part of me had been quietly waiting 6 years for someone in that family to ask exactly that question, without my having to be the one to raise it first. I told her yes, and we went together the following weekend. It was the first time Diane had ever stood at that particular headstone in the 6 years since Noel died. She stood quietly for a long while, reading the dates, the small inscription Noel had chosen for herself, and then she said, simply, that she was sorry it had taken her this long to come. I did not need her to elaborate on everything that sentence was actually carrying. I simply told her that Noel would have appreciated the flowers she had brought, real ones, chosen carefully. They were not the kind you grab quickly from a gas station on the way somewhere else. Odessa asked me, quietly, back at the office the following Monday morning, how the cemetery visit had actually gone. I told her honestly that it had been strange, watching someone finally arrive at a place they should have visited years earlier, grief and relief tangled together, in a way I did not have a clean name for. Odessa, who has buried her own mother and watched more complicated families grieve than almost anyone I know, told me that arriving late to a grave is still arriving. The ground, she said, does not keep score, the way people sometimes fear it does. I have thought about that sentence often since, because it captured something I had been circling myself without quite landing on it. Before I get to what all of this actually taught me, I want to tell you one more small thing, because it is the detail I come back to most. Diane asked me, a few weeks ago, whether she could help me plant something in my own small courtyard behind the firm, a modest bed of roses, cut from Harold's own garden before the house eventually sells. We spent an entire Saturday afternoon out there together, hands in the dirt, barely speaking, the way people work comfortably when the silence between them has finally stopped being something either person needs to fill. The roses are still small, barely established, but they are growing. Every time I walk past that courtyard now, I think about how strange and slow the actual work of becoming family again really is. It happens one Saturday afternoon at a time, with dirt under your fingernails, and very little need to explain yourself out loud. Here is what 15 years in this work, and one sealed envelope, actually taught me, and I want to leave these with you plainly. A person can spend years dismissing your relationship as not quite real family, while someone standing right beside them quietly disagrees. You may never find out about it until it is almost too late to say thank you. If someone in your life is quietly on your side, even imperfectly, even without saying it loudly, notice it while you still can. The noticing matters more than either of you may realize at the time, and it may be years before either of you gets a second chance to say so out loud. Chosen family and biological family are not always in competition. Sometimes the deepest loyalty in a room is a person who belongs to both categories at once. That person keeps quietly choosing, again and again, to make room for someone the rest of the family has not caught up to yet. Do not assume every member of a difficult family shares the same limitations. Some of them are simply waiting for permission or evidence to do differently. Harold was Diane's proof, quietly, all along, and it simply took his death to finally make that proof visible to her. Grief has a way of clearing space for honesty that ordinary life rarely allows. Use that space carefully, because it does not stay open forever. Diane and I found something true in the middle of the worst week of her life. I do not think either of us would have found it under any easier circumstance, which does not make the timing fair, only real. If grief has recently cracked something open in your own family, do not rush to seal it back over. Give yourself the chance to actually look inside it honestly, together, with whoever is standing there willing to look with you. The work of making someone feel like family is never finished with a single gesture. It is built one small, private, repeated choice at a time. That is the way Harold carried that pin for 9 years, without ever once making it about himself. If you want to be the kind of family member people quietly trust, start with one small gesture, and then simply keep choosing it, long after anyone is watching to give you credit. That is, in the end, the entire quiet inheritance Harold left behind, one small rose bed and one small pin at a time, still growing, still being planted, long after he stopped being here to plant it himself. If this story meant something to you, genuinely, tell me in the comments about someone who was quietly on your side, in ways you only fully understood later. Take your time with it. If you need to, some of these stories take years to finally find their own words. I read every single one, usually late at night, coffee gone cold beside me. Subscribe if you want another true story like this one. It starts with a woman finding a lease she never signed.